guys. Tonight we're not just revisiting a dark chapter in colonial American history. We're peering into the bizarre and often terrifying intersection where fervent religious belief, mass hysteria, and what passed for medical or scientific inquiry collided with catastrophic consequences. We are, of course, returning to the infamous Salem Witch Trials of 1692. But tonight our focus is laser-sharp on one of the most disturbing aspects of this tragedy: the utterly outlandish and so-called medical or evidential tests used to prove someone was a witch, and the mindset of the experts and community members who, in their fear and ignorance, believed in them. Forget DNA evidence and peer-reviewed studies. This was an era where a twitching dog, an old woman's mole, or a child's inexplicable fit could be enough to send you to the gallows. Tonight's reality check: you probably wouldn't survive the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the evidence arrayed against you. Your modern, rational mind would reel at the leaps of illogic, the twisting of natural phenomena into proof of demonic compact, and the terrifying certainty with which these pronouncements were made. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, do drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always a profound experience to connect with our global community of thoughtful listeners. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's unsettling exploration of Salem's pseudo-scientific witch hunt. Our story, or rather, your unnerving observation, begins in the tense, God-fearing atmosphere of Salem Village, Massachusetts, in the cold winter of 1691 and early 1692. The small, tightly knit Puritan community is already on edge. Simmering local disputes over land and ministry, anxieties about recent frontier wars with Native Americans, a recent smallpox epidemic, and a deep, abiding belief in the literal, active presence of Satan in the world, constantly seeking to undermine God's chosen people. Into this tinderbox of fear and suspicion, a strange spark falls. It starts in the household of the village minister, the Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty Parris, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, begin to exhibit bizarre and alarming behaviors. They contort their bodies into unnatural positions, utter strange sounds and piercing screams, complain of being pinched, pricked, and bitten by invisible forces. Soon, other young women in the village, like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, begin to display similar afflictions. The community is mystified and terrified. What could be causing these dreadful torments? The initial response, as was common, is to seek a medical explanation. Local physician Dr. William Griggs is called in to examine the afflicted girls. After observing their symptoms, the fits, the convulsions, the seemingly inexplicable pains, and finding no discernible physical cause according to the limited medical knowledge of the time, Dr. Griggs delivers a diagnosis that will have cataclysmic consequences. The girls are under an evil hand. This wasn't a diagnosis of a specific disease. It was a pronouncement rooted in both medical limitations and prevailing Puritan theology that the cause was supernatural, that the girls were bewitched. This medical opinion, coming from a figure of authority, effectively opened the floodgates for a witch hunt. It validated the community's deepest fears and gave a name, witchcraft, to the inexplicable suffering they were witnessing. Historians still debate the true nature of the girls' afflictions. Theories have ranged from outright fraud and attention-seeking to psychological phenomena like conversion disorder or mass hysteria, to even, though now largely discounted, ergot poisoning from contaminated rye bread, which could cause convulsions and hallucinations. Whatever the underlying cause, Dr. Griggs's diagnosis, effectively a medical endorsement of a supernatural explanation, was a crucial turning point. It shifted the focus from finding a natural cure to identifying and punishing the human agents of Satan, believed to be responsible. A quirky, or rather chillingly significant aspect of Puritan medical thought was its frequent intertwining with theology. Illness or misfortune was often seen not just as a physical ailment, but as a potential sign of God's displeasure, or worse, of demonic activity. In a world where the lines between the natural and the supernatural were blurred, a doctor's pronouncement that no physical cause could be found often led directly to the conclusion that the cause must therefore be diabolical. You, a modern man, would be aghast at a medical diagnosis that essentially says, it's the devil. Yet, in 1692, Salem, this was considered a perfectly rational, if terrifying, explanation, and it set the stage for a series of diagnostic tests for witchcraft that would defy all logic and lead to the deaths of 20 innocent people. The medical opinion had been rendered. Now the search for the witches would begin in earnest, armed with a bizarre arsenal of pseudo-scientific and superstitious proofs, with Dr. Griggs's diagnosis of an evil hand hanging heavy in the air. The terrified and bewildered community of Salem Village, egged on by figures like Reverend Parris and the influential Putnam family, began its desperate search for the witches responsible for tormenting the afflicted girls. And one of the first and most bizarre diagnostic tests employed was the creation and administration of a witch cake. This folk magic practice, with roots in English popular belief, involved taking urine from one or more of the afflicted individuals, mixing it with rye meal to make a small cake or biscuit, and then feeding this concoction to a dog, often a dog belonging to the household or neighborhood. The underlying theory, as grotesque as it sounds, was that the dog, upon consuming the witch's water, urine, would either identify the witch responsible or somehow transfer the affliction to the witch, causing them to cry out or reveal themselves. Imagine the scene, a grim and desperate ritual unfolding in a Puritan kitchen. You are, perhaps, a reluctant observer, or you hear about it through the horrified whispers of the village. The afflicted girls are in torment. Someone, perhaps Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved woman who later confessed under duress to making such a cake at the behest of a neighbor, Mary Sibley, or another woman versed in folk remedies, collects the urine. Rye meal is added, kneaded into a crude dough and baked over the hearth. The finished witch cake is then fed to a dog. All eyes are on the unfortunate animal, waiting for some sign, some reaction that can be interpreted as evidence. Will the dog exhibit strange behaviors? Will it bark or whine in a peculiar way? Will it, by some supernatural means, lead them to the tormentor? This practice, while perhaps seeming utterly outlandish to your modern sensibilities, was based on a deeply ingrained belief in sympathetic magic. The idea that an action performed on something connected to a person, like their bodily fluids, could affect that person, even at a distance. It was also a desperate attempt to gain some measure of control, some tangible proof, in the face of inexplicable and terrifying events. The historical record from Salem, particularly the testimony of Tituba, confirms that a witch cake was indeed made, an act that Reverend Parris later condemned as a diabolical attempt to use magic to fight magic. though it was initially undertaken by some as a form of counter-magic or a diagnostic tool. The results of the witch cake test, unsurprisingly, were ambiguous and open to wild interpretation. If the dog simply ate the cake and went about its business, it might be ignored. But if the dog subsequently barked at a particular neighbor, or seemed agitated in their presence, or even just happened to be near someone already under suspicion, this could be twisted into confirmation of that person's guilt. The lack of any scientific basis for such a test, and its reliance on subjective interpretation and pre-existing biases, made it a dangerous and unreliable tool. Yet it played a role in the early stages of the Salem hysteria, further inflaming fears and directing suspicion towards specific individuals. A quirky, or rather deeply disturbing aspect of the witch cake ritual is its very intimacy with the afflicted. The use of their urine, a potent symbol of their suffering, in an attempt to identify their tormentor, speaks to the desperation and the very personal nature of the perceived demonic assault. You, a man of science and reason, would see this as a grotesque and futile exercise in superstition. Yet, for the terrified Puritans of Salem, desperate for answers and for an end to the afflictions, even a test as bizarre as the witch cake offered a glimmer, however illusory, of a way to fight back against the invisible forces they believed were tearing their community apart. And it was just the first of many strange proofs to come. While the witch cake was a rather messy and ultimately inconclusive attempt at supernatural diagnosis, another, more direct and continuous form of evidence relied upon the supposed power of a witch's gaze, the evil eye. The belief that witches could harm, bewitch, or control others simply by looking at them was a deeply ingrained superstition in 17th century New England and Europe. And in Salem, the reactions of the afflicted girls to the mere glance of an accused person were often taken as damning proof of their malevolent power. This turned every public encounter, every courtroom confrontation, into a potential demonstration of witchcraft. Imagine yourself in the Salem meeting house during an examination of a suspected witch. The accused, perhaps an elderly woman known for her sharp tongue, or a man who has had disputes with one of the accuser's families, is brought before the magistrates. As she or he turns her gaze towards the row of afflicted girls, one or more of them might immediately cry out, clutch their throats, or fall into violent convulsions. "She looks upon me, and I am tormented," they might scream. "Her eye, it pierces me like a dagger." This immediate theatrical reaction, occurring in direct response to the accused's gaze, was seen by many as irrefutable evidence that the accused possessed the power of the evil eye and was actively using it to harm the girls, even in the presence of the authorities. The accused might be ordered to look away, and the girls' torments might momentarily subside. Then, commanded to look again, the fits would resume with renewed intensity. This test was performed repeatedly, each instance further solidifying the perception of guilt in the minds of the onlookers and the magistrates. There was no defense against it. If you looked at your accusers, you were bewitching them. If you looked away, you were perhaps ashamed of your evil, or merely biding your time for another spectral assault. The concept of the evil eye, or maleficium affected by sight, provided a simple, visible, and highly dramatic explanation for the girls' afflictions, one that resonated powerfully with prevailing folk beliefs and Puritan anxieties about hidden, demonic evil. The accused might plead, "I look upon them with no ill intent, only with sorrow for their suffering." But such protestations were useless. girl's physical manifestations of pain and torment were seen as the undeniable truth. Historians and psychologists who have studied the Salem events from a modern perspective often point to the power of suggestion, mass hysteria, and even conscious play acting in explaining the afflicted girl's reactions. In such a charged atmosphere, the expectation of being bewitched by a certain person's gaze could itself trigger a psychosomatic response, or provide a compelling script for a convincing performance. A quirky, or rather, tragically absurd extension of the evil eye belief was that even an animal belonging to a witch could supposedly channel its master's or mistress's malevolent gaze. A dog or cat looking intently at one of the afflicted might cause them to cry out, further implicating its owner. You, a modern man, would see this as a horrifying example of how fear and superstition can distort perception and condemn the innocent based on the most tenuous and subjective of evidence. The simple, natural act of looking at another human being was twisted into an act of demonic aggression, a proof of witchcraft that was as inescapable as it was invisible to all but the accusers themselves. And in Salem, what the afflicted claimed to see, however spectral or imaginary, quickly became a deadly reality for those caught in their unblinking, accusatory stare. Perhaps one of the most theatrical and, to the 17th century Puritan mind, compelling forms of evidence presented during the Salem Witch Trials was the touch test. This bizarre ritual involved having an accused witch touch one of the afflicted individuals while that person was in the midst of a convulsive fit. If the fit then ceased or significantly lessened, it was taken as proof that the accused was indeed the source of the torment. The idea being that the malevolent influence or witchcraft flowed back into the witch's body upon physical contact, thereby releasing the victim. For you, witnessing, or heaven forbid, being subjected to this test, it would be a terrifying demonstration of Salem's inverted logic, where an act that seemingly brought relief was twisted into damning evidence of guilt. Imagine the scene, played out repeatedly in the Salem meeting house or during pre-trial examinations. An afflicted girl, perhaps Ann Putnam Jr. or Mercy Lewis, is writhing on the floor, screaming, her body contorted, apparently in the throes of a violent, supernaturally induced fit. She cries out that your specter, or that of another accused person, is tormenting her. The magistrates, grave and concerned, order you, the accused, to approach and touch the girl. You might hesitate, filled with a dreadful foreboding. What new trickery is this? But refusal is not an option. It would only be seen as further proof of your guilt, an unwillingness to cure the victim you have supposedly bewitched. So, reluctantly, fearfully, you reach out and lay your hand, perhaps ever so gently, on the arm or shoulder of the convulsing girl. And then, the miracle happens. As soon as you touch her, her convulsions begin to subside. Her screams lessen. Her body gradually relaxes. She might open her eyes, look around with a dazed expression, and declare that the torment has ceased, that your touch has healed her, at least for that moment. The crowd gasps. The magistrates nod grimly. For them, this is not proof of your innocence or your healing power. It is irrefutable evidence that you were the one causing the fit, and that by touching her, you have reabsorbed the demonic effluvia, the venomous and malignant particles that were afflicting her. You have, in their eyes, been caught red-handed, your witchcraft made manifest. The touch test was based on a folk belief that a witch had a kind of physical connection to their magic, and that direct contact could reverse or recall the spell. A concept that found some twisted justification in contemporary demonological theories. Your mind reels. How can an act that brings apparent relief be proof of guilt? But there is no arguing with the logic of Salem. The magistrates might even repeat the test, ordering you to withdraw your hand, whereupon the girl might immediately fall back into her fits, only to be cured again when you are forced to touch her once more. This dramatic on-demand demonstration of your supposed power was incredibly persuasive to an audience already primed to believe in witchcraft. Historians note that the touch test was a particularly insidious form of evidence because it placed the accused in an impossible double bind. If the victim's fit didn't stop upon their touch, it could be argued that the witch was too powerful or too stubborn. If it did stop, it proved their guilt. A quirky, or rather deeply disturbing question that arises is the extent to which the afflicted girls were consciously manipulating these tests, or if they were so caught up in the hysteria, so suggestible, that they genuinely experienced a psychosomatic reaction to the touch of someone they had been conditioned to believe was their tormentor. You, a modern man, would see this as a tragic farce, a horrifying example of how mass delusion and flawed reasoning can condemn the innocent. But in the charged atmosphere of Salem, the touch test was seen as a powerful, almost scientific method of unmasking the devil's agents. And for you, the accused, every touch, every apparent cure, was another nail in your coffin, while spectral evidence and the touch test provided proof of your demonic actions. The authorities in Salem also sought physical, tangible evidence on your very body, the infamous witch's teat, or witch's mark. Rooted in centuries of European witchcraft lore, it was widely believed that witches made a pact with the devil, sealed by his leaving a mark on their body, and that they also possessed an extra nipple or protuberance, the witch's teat, where their animal familiars, imps, or demons in animal form, would suckle blood or receive nourishment. The discovery of any such mark, however innocuous, was considered strong, if not conclusive, physical evidence of witchcraft, leading to invasive and humiliating bodily examinations of the accused. Imagine, after weeks of imprisonment and grueling interrogations, you are informed that you are to be physically searched for these demonic stigmata. You are taken to a private room, or perhaps even a more public space, if privacy is deemed unnecessary for a suspected witch, and stripped of your clothing. A panel of examiners, often consisting of discreet and sober matrons from the community, if you are a woman, or sometimes a male physician, a midwife, or even just a group of designated searchers, proceeds to scrutinize every inch of your body. They are looking for anything unusual: moles, warts, birthmarks, old scars, skin tags, or any other blemish that could be interpreted through the lens of their pre-existing conviction of your guilt as a mark left by Satan, or a teat for a suckling imp. The process was inherently subjective and biased. Any natural skin irregularity could be deemed suspicious if the examiners were determined to find proof. This is not a gentle or respectful examination. Your body is poked, prodded, and palpated. The examiners might confer in hushed, serious tones, pointing out a mole on your back, a small discoloration on your arm, an old scar from a childhood accident. Each is a potential sign of your damnation. They are particularly interested in finding any mark that is insensitive to pain or that does not bleed when pricked, supposed characteristics of a true witch's mark. So, they might take a pin or a needle, likely unsterilized, and prick these suspicious blemishes. If you flinch or cry out, it might be dismissed. But if, due to nerve damage, calloused skin, or sheer stoic endurance, you do not react strongly, or if a mark bleeds less than expected, this could be taken as damning evidence. The pricking of suspected witches to find insensitive spots was a common practice in European witch hunts, often carried out by professional witch finders who claimed special expertise in identifying such marks. The humiliation of this public or semi-public exposure and invasive scrutiny is profound. Your body, your most private self, is being violated, turned into an object of morbid curiosity and suspicion. Its natural imperfections twisted into signs of demonic allegiance. For women, in particular, these examinations were a terrifying and degrading experience, often conducted by other women, but within a patriarchal system that viewed the female body as inherently more susceptible to demonic influence and corruption. A quirky, or rather utterly baseless belief was that these witches' marks could sometimes be invisible to ordinary sight and could only be found by those with special insight or through specific methods of examination. This, of course, made it even harder for the accused to refute any findings. You, a modern man, would recognize this as a horrifying abuse of power, a pseudo-scientific charade designed to find guilt where none existed. But in 1692, Salem, the search for the witch's teat, was a deadly, serious business, and the discovery of any unnatural excrescence or privy mark on your body could be another heavy weight tipping the scales of justice towards the gallows. While the search for the witch's teat involved invasive physical examinations, another, perhaps even more dubious, category of expert sometimes emerged in witch hunts. Though their prominence in Salem itself is less documented than in some European contexts. The witch pricker. These individuals, often self-proclaimed or itinerant experts, claimed a special ability to identify witches by pricking their bodies with long pins or bodkins to find the devil's mark, a spot supposedly left by Satan that was insensitive to pain and would not bleed. Though the official Salem examinations were primarily conducted by local panels, the underlying belief in such physical stigmata and the methods for finding them were part of the broader witchcraft panic that influenced New England. Imagine the terror if such a specialist were called upon, or if local examiners adopted similar methods with a chilling conviction. This isn't just a search for visible blemishes. This is an active, painful probing for hidden proof. The witch pricker, armed with his collection of needles and pins of varying lengths, would systematically prick your body, particularly any suspicious moles, warts, or scars, but sometimes even seemingly normal areas of skin. He is looking for that one spot, that telltale patch of flesh, where the pin slides in without causing you to cry out, or without drawing a drop of blood. The theory was that the devil, in sealing his pact, had desensitized a small area of the witch's body, rendering it impervious to normal sensation. The process itself is a form of torture. You are stripped, exposed, and subjected to repeated painful pricking. Each jab of the needle is a fresh assault. If you cry out in pain, the pricker might accuse you of feigning, of trying to hide your true nature. If you manage to endure the pain stoically, perhaps out of sheer terror, or a desperate attempt to prove your innocence by not reacting like a witch, who was often expected to be overly sensitive or hysterical, your very stoicism could be twisted against you. "See," the pricker might exclaim, "he feels no pain. This is surely the devil's mark." It is an impossible situation where any reaction, or lack thereof, can be interpreted as guilt. The methods of these witch prickers were often fraudulent, with some using retractable needles or other tricks to prove the existence of insensitive spots, thereby securing their reputation and their fees, as they were often paid for each witch they identified. While direct evidence of professional witch prickers operating extensively in Salem is scarce compared to some witch hunts in Scotland or England, the underlying belief in physical marks and the practice of testing for them certainly informed the examinations conducted by local authorities and citizen panels. The search for physical anomalies, whether by pricking or simple observation, provided a desperately sought-after, tangible proof in a crime that was otherwise based on invisible specters and subjective experiences. A quirky, or rather diabolically ingenious, aspect of the witch pricker's trade was the way it preyed on natural variations in human anatomy and pain perception. Some people are naturally more or less sensitive to pain in certain areas. Some blemishes bleed less than others. In the hands of a biased or fraudulent examiner, these normal variations could easily be twisted into irrefutable evidence of a demonic pact. You, a modern man, would be horrified by this barbaric and utterly unscientific assault. This trial by needlepoint. The idea that your fate could hang on whether a particular mole bleeds when pricked, or whether you can suppress a cry of pain, is a chilling testament to the depths of delusion and cruelty that characterize the witch hunts. It's a medical test, where the only possible diagnosis in the hands of a true believer is guilt, while physical examinations like searching for the witch's teat or pricking were employed. Another, even more ancient and dramatic form of testing for witchcraft, though thankfully less central to the official Salem proceedings than in some European witch trials, still lingered in the popular imagination and influenced the perception of guilt. The ordeal by water, or the swimming test. This barbaric practice was based on the belief that water, being a pure element and often consecrated for the purpose, would reject a witch, causing her to float, while an innocent person, accepted by the water, would sink. The twisted logic was that if you floated, you were guilty and would be executed. If you sank, and likely drowned unless quickly pulled out, you were deemed innocent, albeit posthumously in many cases. Imagine the terror of being accused in a community where such a belief, even if not officially sanctioned by the highest Salem courts for a formal verdict, might still be countenanced by some local zealots or a frightened mob, while the Salem magistrates relied more on spectral evidence and confessions. The undercurrent of such folk beliefs about ordeals was always present. The very idea of being subjected to such a test would be horrifying. You would be bound, often thumb to opposite toe, to prevent you from swimming, and then thrown into a river or pond. A rope would typically be tied around your waist, held by people on the bank, supposedly to pull you out if you began to sink, and were thus innocent. But the process was fraught with peril and open to gross manipulation. The way you were bound, the currents of the water, the skill, or lack thereof, of those holding the rope, all could influence the outcome. The ordeal by water for witchcraft was officially condemned by many church authorities and legal systems in Europe well before the 17th century. But it persisted in popular practice and unofficial tests in some areas due to its dramatic and seemingly definitive nature. Its use in New England was rare and generally frowned upon by the more learned clergy and magistrates. by 1692. But the idea of it, the folk memory, could still contribute to an atmosphere where bizarre proofs were considered. The science or theology behind it was, of course, entirely fallacious. A person's buoyancy depends on body fat, lung capacity, and the density of their clothing, not their allegiance to Satan. Women, often having a higher body fat percentage than men, were perhaps more likely to float, further stacking the odds against them in a witch hunt that already disproportionately targeted females. Historians of witchcraft trials view ordeals like the swimming test as prime examples of how pre-scientific worldviews, superstition, and a desire for seemingly divine judgment could lead to horrific injustices, where the accused had virtually no chance of proving their innocence and surviving. A quirky, or rather grotesquely ironic, outcome of the swimming test was that even if you passed by sinking, you might still die from drowning or from the subsequent exposure and shock, your innocence proven only at the cost of your life. You, a modern man, would see this as a horrifying Kafkaesque ritual, a deadly game where all outcomes lead to suffering or death. The thought of your life depending on whether you float or sink in a cold, murky pond at the behest of a terrified and superstitious crowd is a chilling reminder of the thin veneer of reason that can sometimes separate societies from barbarism. While Salem primarily used spectral and confessional evidence, the shadow of these older, more physical ordeals undoubtedly informed the general credulity towards bizarre forms of proof. Beyond the dramatic and often physical tests for witchcraft, the Salem authorities also paid close attention to your words, or lack thereof, particularly during moments of religious observance. In a devout Puritan society where public piety and correct recitation of scripture and prayers were considered essential markers of a true Christian, any perceived hesitation, error, or inability to recite sacred texts flawlessly by an accused individual could be interpreted as damning evidence of their demonic allegiance, the devil supposedly rendering them incapable of uttering God's holy words. This turned even the most sacred acts of faith into potential traps for the accused. Imagine being brought before the magistrates or the assembled congregation in the meeting house, already under the immense stress of accusation and imprisonment. You are then commanded to recite the Lord's Prayer, or perhaps a specific psalm or catechism answer, as a test of your spiritual state. Your mind is racing, your heart pounding. You are terrified, exhausted, and perhaps struggling to focus through a haze of hunger and despair. In such a state, it would be easy for anyone, even the most devout, to stumble over a word, to misremember a phrase, or for their voice to tremble with emotion. But for you, the accused witch, any such imperfection is not seen as a normal human failing. It is pounced upon as a sign of demonic interference. See, your accusers or the magistrates might exclaim, "He cannot speak the Lord's Prayer aright. The devil chokes his words. This is surely a witch." The pressure to perform these religious recitations perfectly, under intense public scrutiny, and with your life hanging in the balance, would be almost unbearable. The belief that witches were unable to correctly recite the Lord's Prayer was a common superstition in witchcraft lore, and it provided a seemingly simple, yet devastatingly effective test that was heavily weighted against the accused, especially those who were uneducated, elderly, or simply overcome by terror. Even a momentary lapse of memory, a slip of the tongue, or a voice cracking with emotion could be twisted into proof of your guilt. George Burroughs, a former minister himself, famously recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly from the gallows, an act that deeply unsettled the crowd and momentarily cast doubt on his guilt. Yet even this was rationalized away by figures like Cotton Mather, who argued that the devil could also feign piety. The emphasis on verbal orthodoxy and flawless recitation in Puritan culture made this a particularly potent form of evidence. Any deviation was suspect. If you recited the prayer too quickly, you were perhaps trying to rush through it, your heart not truly in it. If you recited it too slowly, you were struggling against demonic resistance. There was no way to win. A quirky, or rather cruelly ironic, aspect of this test was that the intense anxiety and fear generated by the accusation and the public examination itself could easily cause someone to stumble over their words, thus proving the very thing they were desperately trying to refute. You, a modern man, would recognize the injustice of judging someone's spiritual state, let alone their guilt of a capital crime, based on their ability to perform a rote recitation under extreme duress. But in the charged atmosphere of Salem, a misspoken word, a moment of hesitation in prayer, could be as damning as any spectral vision or witch's mark. It was another example of how the ordinary frailties of human nature were reinterpreted through the dark lens of witchcraft suspicion, transforming innocent slips into signs of demonic allegiance, while the afflicted girls and their spectral testimonies formed the core of the prosecution's case in Salem. Another, more insidious form of evidence often came from your own neighbors, acquaintances, or even family members. A collection of observations about your past behavior, your temperament, your animals, or even your perceived knowledge, all now reinterpreted through the dark filter of witchcraft suspicion. Hearsay, gossip, old grudges, and misunderstandings, often stretching back years, were dredged up and presented as proof of your long-standing malevolence and your compact with the devil, creating a damning narrative from the mundane details of your everyday life. For you, the accused, it was horrifying to see your past actions, once innocent or trivial, now twisted into evidence of diabolical intent. Imagine hearing testimony in court or during your examination from someone you've known for years, perhaps a neighbor with whom you once had a minor dispute over a wandering cow or a property line. Now, that neighbor stands before the magistrates and recounts how, after your disagreement, their cow mysteriously fell ill, or their butter wouldn't churn, or their child suffered a nightmare. These past misfortunes, once attributed to natural causes or bad luck, are now laid squarely at your doorstep, reinterpreted as acts of your malevolent witchcraft, your revenge exacted through supernatural means. Or perhaps someone testifies that you own a black cat that seems unusually intelligent, or that your gaze once made them feel uneasy, or that you possess an uncanny knowledge of herbs and folk remedies, which could easily be twisted into evidence of potion making or communing with spirits. Even your temperament could be used against you. If you were known to be cantankerous, argumentative, or simply a bit eccentric, these traits could now be seen as signs of a witch's inherently disagreeable and disruptive nature. If you were reclusive or kept to yourself, you were secretive and likely plotting evil. If you were too friendly or outgoing, you were perhaps trying to lure unsuspecting innocents into your demonic web. The confirmation bias at play was immense. Once someone was accused, almost any aspect of their past life or personality could be, and often was, selectively reinterpreted to fit the narrative of a witch. This evidence from informants, often based on little more than suspicion, gossip, or personal animosity, was given considerable weight by the Salem courts. Social historians studying the Salem crisis often highlight the role of pre-existing village factionalism, economic disputes, and personal rivalries in fueling the accusations, as the witch hunt provided a convenient and divinely sanctioned way to settle old scores or eliminate social undesirables. A quirky, or rather deeply unnerving aspect of this type of testimony was its sheer unverifiable subjectivity. How do you defend yourself against someone's claim that your look made their child ill, or that your cat seemed to understand human speech? It's your word against theirs, and in an atmosphere of rampant fear, the accuser, particularly if they align themselves with the afflicted, is almost always believed. You, modern man, would be aghast at this guilt by association, or guilt by past triviality. The idea that your entire life could be retroactively scoured for any perceived abnormality, any unfortunate coincidence, and then presented as a chain of evidence leading to a witchcraft conviction, is a terrifying prospect. It means that no one is truly safe, as everyone has had disagreements or experienced misfortune, or possesses some small eccentricity that could, in the wrong hands, be twisted into a sign of demonic compact. Beyond verbal testimony and bodily examinations, the Salem witch hunters also sought tangible physical proof of witchcraft, and one of the most damning pieces of such evidence, if found, was the poppet, a small doll or figurine, often made of cloth, wax, or wood, believed to be used by witches to represent their victims and inflict harm upon them by proxy. The discovery of a poppet, particularly one stuck with pins, thorns, or other sharp objects, in the possession or home of an accused witch, was considered powerful, almost irrefutable, evidence of maleficium, the practice of harmful magic, and a clear sign of their allegiance with Satan. For you, the accused, the discovery of such an item, whether planted or innocently misunderstood, could be a death sentence. Imagine your home being searched by the constable and other officials, or perhaps by a group of self-appointed witch finders from the village. They rummage through your meager possessions, overturning furniture, peering into dark corners, their eyes alight with suspicion, looking for any sign of demonic paraphernalia. And then, a cry of triumph. They emerge holding a small, crudely made doll, perhaps one your children played with, or a simple folk charm you kept for good luck. But now, in their hands, it is transformed into a sinister instrument of witchcraft. Perhaps a few pins are found stuck into it, or it is claimed to resemble one of the afflicted girls. The discovery is announced with great fanfare, presented to the magistrates as undeniable proof of your evil practices. The belief in the power of poppets and image magic was deeply ingrained in both European and New England folk culture and demonological literature. It was thought that by creating an effigy of a person and then sticking pins into it, burning it, or otherwise tormenting it, a witch could cause corresponding pain, illness, or even death to the actual person. The famous witchcraft manual, Malleus Maleficarum, though written centuries earlier, and other contemporary treatises on witchcraft, described in detail the use of poppets and other forms of image magic, and these ideas heavily influenced Puritan beliefs about how witches operated. Your protestations that the doll is just a child's toy or a harmless trinket are, of course, dismissed. Who but a witch would possess such an object? The presence of pins is seen as clear evidence of malicious intent. Even if the puppet is featureless, the afflicted girls might be brought in to identify it as the very instrument being used to torment their specters. The case of Bridget Bishop, the first person executed in the Salem Witch Trials, involved testimony about poppets with pins being found in her house, which contributed significantly to her conviction. A quirky, or rather tragically ironic possibility is that such poppets could easily be planted in an accused person's home by their enemies, or that ordinary household objects could be maliciously misinterpreted. A forgotten child's doll, a sewing needle case with pins stuck in it for storage. In the fevered atmosphere of Salem, anything could become evidence. You, a modern man, would see the absurdity of it all, the leap from a simple doll to a demonic pact. But in 1692, this was deadly serious. The discovery of a poppet in your possession was like finding a smoking gun, a tangible link to the invisible world of evil, and a very solid nail in your coffin. It transformed you from a suspected witch into a proven practitioner of the black arts, all based on a child's plaything or planted piece of evidence, another piece of supposed physical evidence eagerly sought by the Salem witch hunters, though perhaps more legendary than commonly found, was the Black Book or Devil's Book. It was widely believed in Puritan and European witchcraft lore that individuals entering into a pact with Satan were required to sign or make their mark in a book, pledging their allegiance to him and renouncing their Christian baptism, and that this book contained the names of all the witches in a particular coven or region. The discovery of such a book, or even a credible testimony about its existence and contents, would be seen as definitive proof of an organized demonic conspiracy. Imagine the intense pressure during your interrogation. The magistrates, having already heard spectral testimonies and perhaps found a poppet, now demand to know about the Devil's Book. "Goodman, your name," they might thunder. "You have covenanted with the black man. You have signed his infernal book. Where is it? Who else has put their mark therein? Reveal the names of your confederates in this wicked plot against God and Salem." They might describe the book in lurid detail, perhaps bound in black leather, its pages filled with signatures written in blood, its very touch capable of corrupting the innocent. They are not just looking for your individual guilt. They are trying to uncover the full extent of Satan's army in their midst. Of course, no such physical Devil's Book with a list of Salem witches was ever actually found, despite the fervent belief in its existence. However, the idea of the book was a powerful tool for extracting confessions and further accusations. Under duress, some confessed witches would remember seeing such a book, or even claim to have signed it themselves. They might then be pressured to recall other names they saw in its pages, or who was present when they signed. The concept of the Devil's Book served as a powerful narrative device, transforming individual accusations into evidence of a large-scale, organized demonic conspiracy, which in turn justified the escalating scope and intensity of the witch hunt. The pressure on you to reveal information about this book would be immense. If you deny its existence, you are being stubborn, deceitful, protecting your fellow witches. If you were to invent details about such a book, or falsely name others as signatories, you might be seen as cooperating, but at the cost of further damning yourself and innocent others. the psychological torment of being pressured to testify about something that does not exist, but which your accusers and judges fervently believe in, would be another layer of the Salem nightmare. A quirky, or rather deeply revealing aspect of the Devil's Book narrative is how it reflects the Puritan emphasis on literacy, covenants, and formal agreements. In a society where church covenants and legal documents were so important, it made a perverse kind of sense that even a pact with Satan would involve a written, signed contract. You, a modern man, would recognize the absurdity of searching for a literal membership roll for a demonic conspiracy. But for the 17th century Puritan mind, steeped in biblical literalism and a belief in a very real, very legalistic devil, the Black Book was a terrifyingly plausible artifact, and your inability or refusal to produce it or to name those whose signatures it supposedly contained would only serve as further proof of your obstinate allegiance to the Prince of Darkness, while the swimming test was a form of ordeal by water, largely discredited, though still feared, by the time of the Salem Trials. Other, more ancient forms of trial by ordeal, though not formally employed by the court of Oyez and Terminer, might still have lurked in the background of popular belief, or been threatened in more informal extra-legal contexts. Trial by ordeal, in its various forms, was a medieval judicial practice in which the guilt or innocence of an accused person was determined by subjecting them to a painful, often dangerous, physical test, the outcome of which was believed to be a direct judgment from God. Though largely superseded by more formal legal processes by the 17th century, the underlying idea that God would intervene to protect the innocent and expose the guilty in such a test could still hold sway in a community gripped by supernatural fear. Imagine the terror if, in addition to the spectral evidence and the search for witches' marks, you were also faced with the threat, however remote or unofficial, of an ordeal like trial by fire. This ancient practice involved the accused carrying a red-hot piece of iron for a certain distance, or walking barefoot over burning plowshares. The resulting burn would then be bandaged and inspected after a set number of days. If the wound was healing cleanly, it was taken as a sign of God's favor and thus innocence. If it was festering and infected, a near certainty given the lack of antisepsis, it was proof of guilt. The logic was that God would miraculously heal the innocent. The ordeal by fire, like the ordeal by water, was a barbaric practice with a high probability of proving guilt, regardless of actual innocence, as infection was almost inevitable, and clean healing a matter of pure chance or subjective interpretation by the examiners. While there is no strong evidence that formal trial by fire was used in Salem, the concept of a divine judgment manifested through physical trial was not entirely alien to the Puritan mindset, which saw God's hand in all earthly events. The very afflictions of the girls were, in a sense, seen as a divine sign of witchcraft at work. The intense pressure on the accused to confess, and the belief that an unrepentant witch would face eternal damnation, also carried echoes of a spiritual ordeal. The transition from formal ordeals to jury trials and testimonial evidence was a long and complex process in legal history, and the Salem trials occurred at a point where older, more superstitious forms of proof still held a powerful sway over the popular imagination, even if they weren't always explicitly codified in the official legal proceedings. A quirky, or rather chillingly arbitrary aspect of many historical ordeals was the lack of any rational connection between the test and the alleged crime. Why would an inability to float or a cleanly healing burn prove prove or disprove one's allegiance to Satan. The answer lies in a pre-scientific worldview where divine intervention was expected in judicial matters. You, a modern man, would see these ordeals as nothing more than state-sanctioned torture, designed to elicit confessions or provide a pseudo-divine justification for predetermined guilt. The very thought of your innocence, depending on the whim of a festering wound, or the buoyancy of your body in water, would be a terrifying descent into irrationality. And while Salem's proofs were primarily spectral and confessional, the shadow of these more ancient, brutal ordeals arguably contributed to the atmosphere of terror and the willingness to accept the most outlandish forms of evidence. In the Salem Witch Trials, the experts who presumed to identify and pass judgment on accused witches were not trained forensic scientists or impartial investigators in the modern sense. Instead, the primary authorities on witchcraft were the local magistrates and ministers, men whose expertise derived not from empirical evidence or scientific method, but from their interpretation of Scripture, their understanding of Puritan demonology, their knowledge of European witchcraft precedents, often from dubious sources, and their own deeply ingrained belief in the reality and ever-present threat of satanic power. Their diagnosis of witchcraft was often a foregone conclusion, their examinations designed to confirm, not question, the initial accusations. Imagine facing a panel of these grave, self-assured men, magistrates like John Hathorne, an ancestor of author Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Jonathan Corwin conducted the initial examinations with an aggressive inquisitorial style, often assuming guilt from the outset. They were not neutral arbiters. They saw themselves as defenders of the community against a demonic onslaught. Their questions were leading, designed to trap the accused or elicit a confession. Their interpretation of evidence, the fits of the afflicted girls, the spectral testimonies, the witches' marks, was filtered through their unshakable belief in the supernatural. The lack of legal training, in the modern sense, for many colonial magistrates, combined with their strong religious convictions, often led to a disregard for basic principles of due process and fair trial. Then there were the ministers, figures like Samuel Parris, Nicholas Noyes, and the influential Cotton Mather from Boston. They provided the theological framework that underpinned the witch hunt. They preached fiery sermons about the devil's work in New England, interpreted biblical passages to support the reality of witchcraft, and often participated directly in the examinations and trials, exhorting the accused to confess. Cotton Mather's writings, such as Memorable Providences relating to witchcrafts and possessions, 1689, and later his defense of the Salem trials in 17, Wonders of the Invisible World, 1693, were highly influential in shaping public and official opinion, lending an air of learned authority to the proceedings. While some ministers, particularly later in the trials or from outside Salem, urged caution and expressed skepticism about the reliability of spectral evidence, the dominant clerical voices in Salem itself were often strong proponents of vigorous prosecution. These experts believed they possessed a special insight into the workings of the demonic world. They had read the European treatises on witchcraft. They knew the supposed signs and behaviors of witches, and they saw themselves as God's instruments in a holy war against Satan. The tragic irony is that their expertise was often a collection of superstitions, misinterpretations, and flawed theological arguments, a applied with a terrifying certainty to the lives of innocent people. A quirky, or rather profoundly arrogant, aspect of this expertise was the frequent dismissal of any rational or natural explanations for the strange events occurring. If a cow died, if a child fell ill, if someone suffered a misfortune after a disagreement with an accused person, it was easier, and in their worldview, more correct, to attribute it to witchcraft than to consider disease, accident, or coincidence. You, a modern man, would be aghast at the certitude of these experts, their unshakable belief in their own ability to discern demonic influence, and their willingness to send people to their deaths based on such flimsy and subjective evidence. It is a chilling reminder that expertise without humility, without critical thinking, and without a foundation in verifiable fact can become a dangerous tool of oppression. One of the enduring questions surrounding the Salem Witch Trials is why the afflicted girls, whose accusations and dramatic torments fueled the entire crisis, were so readily and uncritically believed by the authorities and much of the community. Part of the answer lies in the complete inability of the actual medical knowledge and practices of the late 17th century to provide any convincing natural or physiological explanation for the girls' bizarre and often terrifying symptoms, leaving a vacuum that was easily filled by supernatural interpretations. When medicine failed or admitted its limitations, the devil and his witches often became the default diagnosis. Imagine being a parent or a community member in Salem in 1692, witnessing these young women, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and others, writhing in apparent agony, contorting their bodies, uttering strange sounds, complaining of being pinched, choked, and tormented by invisible forces. They might have periods of blindness, deafness, or muteness. They might suffer from seizures that mimic epilepsy. These are undeniably distressing and alarming symptoms. You call upon the local physician, Dr. William Griggs. He examines the girls, applies what little medical knowledge he possesses, and finds no discernible physical cause. He cannot explain it. He cannot cure it. What is he and the community to conclude? In a pre-scientific era with limited understanding of diseases like epilepsy, conversion disorder, or other neurological or psychological conditions that could manifest in such physical symptoms, the conclusion that no natural cause can be found often led directly to the assumption of a supernatural cause. The Puritan worldview was steeped in a belief in an active interventionist God and an equally active malevolent Satan. The world was a battleground between these forces. If God allowed such a suffering, and if human medicine was powerless, then surely it must be the work of the devil, acting through his human agents, witches. This was not necessarily an irrational leap of faith within their belief system. It was a logical, if terrifying, conclusion based on their understanding of how the world worked. The failure of 17th century medicine to explain or treat the afflictions thus became, paradoxically, a powerful argument for the reality of witchcraft. The dramatic and often public nature of the girls' fits, particularly when they occurred in the presence of an accused witch or during court proceedings, further cemented this belief. It was proof that could be seen and heard, far more compelling to many than the protestations of innocence from an accused individual. The very inexplicability of the symptoms, from a medical standpoint of the time, lent credence to the supernatural explanation. A quirky, or rather tragically ironic detail is that some of the cures or diagnostic tests employed, like the witch cake, were themselves forms of folk magic, indicating that even those attempting to combat witchcraft were operating within a largely superstitious, rather than scientific, framework. You, a modern man, with even a basic understanding of medicine, psychology, and the scientific method, would see a host of potential natural explanations for the girl's symptoms, or at least recognize the profound limitations of 17th century medical diagnosis. But in Salem, the failure of medicine to provide answers opened the door wide for the experts in demonology and witchcraft to step in, with devastating consequences. The doctor's shrug became the witch hunter's certainty, while the dominant explanation for the afflictions in Salem quickly became witchcraft. It's worth noting that even within the 17th century worldview, there were attempts, however flawed or rudimentary, to provide scientific or at least learned explanations for how magic and demonic influence might actually operate, often drawing on a mixture of ancient philosophy, alchemical theories, and garbled interpretations of natural phenomena. These pseudo-scientific theories, far from debunking witchcraft, often served to reinforce belief in its reality by providing a seemingly rational, within their own framework, underpinning for its supposed mechanisms, thus lending an air of intellectual respectability to the witch hunts. For you, the accused, these learned explanations would be just another layer of incomprehensible proof arrayed against you. Imagine listening to a minister or a magistrate, perhaps even a figure like Cotton Mather, who was a scholar and a member of the Royal Society in London, an early scientific organization, expound on how witches might cause their mischief. They might speak of effluvia, invisible, noxious particles or vapors that a witch could supposedly project from her body, particularly through her eyes, the evil eye, to strike and torment her victims. This theory, drawing on ancient ideas about contagious miasmas and emanations, provided a physical, though still invisible mechanism for spectral attacks. Or they might discuss the role of animal familiars, imps or demons in the shape of cats, dogs, birds, or even toads, which were believed to serve the witch, carrying out her malevolent commands, or suckling at her witch's teat to draw nourishment and power. The presence of an ordinary household pet could thus be twisted into evidence of demonic collusion. There were also theories based on a misunderstanding of natural forces. For example, strange weather patterns, crop failures, or sudden illnesses in livestock might be attributed to a witch's manipulation of the elements, or her casting of spells, perhaps by disturbing the humors of the air or the earth, concepts drawn from ancient and medieval medical theory. The lines between natural philosophy, medicine, alchemy, astrology, and demonology were often blurred in the 17th century, and scientific explanations could easily incorporate supernatural or occult elements without perceived contradiction. Some learned individuals might even attempt to explain the fits and convulsions of the afflicted girls in terms of an imbalance of bodily humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, the cornerstones of Galenic medicine, which still held sway, but then argue that this imbalance was caused by a witch's spell or demonic possession, thus still leading back to a supernatural culprit. The intellectual framework of the time often sought to reconcile observed phenomena with pre-existing theological and demonological beliefs, rather than challenging those beliefs with empirical evidence in the modern scientific sense. A quirky, or rather revealing, aspect of these scientific explanations for witchcraft was their often incredible complexity and convolution, involving elaborate theories about the nature of spirits, the properties of matter, the influence of celestial bodies, and the precise mechanics of demonic pacts. You, a modern man, would find these theories utterly bewildering, a bizarre mishmash of garbled science, superstition, and theological dogma. Yet, for the experts of Salem, these explanations provided a comforting, for them, sense of order and understanding in the face of terrifying and inexplicable events. They weren't just fighting blind superstition. They were combating a scientifically, by their lights, understood demonic assault. And this learned justification made their persecution of accused witches all the more relentless and terrifyingly certain. The intellectual climate of 17th century New England, and by extension Salem, was heavily influenced not only by Puritan theology and folk beliefs, but also by a body of European literature on witchcraft, demonology, and witch hunting that had been accumulating for centuries. Authoritative texts, such as the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, first published in Germany in 1487, and later works by influential jurists and theologians, provided a detailed guidebook for identifying, interrogating, trying, and punishing witches. And these texts, or at least their core ideas, undoubtedly shaped the mindset and methods of the Salem authorities. For you, the accused, the shadow of these European precedents loomed large, providing a seemingly unassailable intellectual and legal justification for your persecution. Imagine the ministers and magistrates of Salem consulting these learned, if often deeply misogynistic and brutal, treatises. The Malleus Maleficarum, for example, offered detailed proofs of witchcraft, described the supposed nature of the pact with the devil, detailed the types of harm witches could inflict, and provided specific instructions on how to conduct interrogations to extract confessions, often through torture, though overt physical torture was less systematically applied in Salem compared to some European trials. The psychological pressure and harsh imprisonment served a similar function. It also famously argued that women were inherently more susceptible to demonic temptation than men, a belief that likely contributed to the disproportionate number of women accused in most witch hunts, including Salem. Other influential works by authors like Jean Baudin, Nicolas Remy, or King James III of England, whose demonology endorsed witch hunting, further solidified the belief in a vast, organized conspiracy of witches working to undermine Christendom. These books described witches' Sabbaths, nocturnal flights, transvection, magical travel, shape-shifting, and the suckling of familiars in lurid detail, creating a terrifying, internally consistent, if entirely fictional portrait of the enemy. The availability of these texts in colonial libraries, and their study by educated men like Cotton Mather, provided a scholarly framework that legitimized the fears of the populace and guided the actions of the authorities. When the afflicted girls in Salem began describing experiences that mirrored those found in these European texts, spectral torments, pressure to sign the devil's book, visions of witches' meetings, it seemed to confirm that Salem was indeed facing the same demonic assault that had plagued Europe for centuries. This reliance on European precedents, however, was not without its critics, even at the time. Some more skeptical ministers and thinkers argued that the conditions in New England were different, or that the methods used in European witch hunts were unjust and unreliable. But in the heat of the Salem crisis, these cautious voices were often drowned out by the clamor for decisive action, fueled by the authoritative pronouncements found in the demonological literature. The Salem trials can thus be seen, in part, as an unfortunate colonial echo of a much larger transatlantic witch-hunting phenomenon, with local anxieties and conflicts being interpreted and prosecuted through a pre-existing European framework of belief and procedure. A quirky, or rather, profoundly disturbing aspect of these witchcraft treatises was their often obsessive focus on the supposed sexual aspects of witchcraft, detailing lurid encounters with incubi and succubi, and the devil's supposed carnal relations with his followers. While this sexual element was less overtly emphasized in the Salem testimonies compared to some European trials, it formed part of the underlying, often deeply misogynistic, understanding of what it meant to be a witch. You, a modern man, would be horrified by the way these old, prejudiced, and often entirely fantastical texts were used as expert guides to identify and condemn innocent people. It is a chilling example of how book learning, when divorced from critical thinking and empirical evidence, can become a tool of profound injustice and cruelty in the face of the bizarre and terrifying events unfolding in Salem. The inexplicable fits of the afflicted girls, the spectral accusations, the seemingly preternatural knowledge some accusers displayed. It might seem natural from a modern perspective to consider psychological or even mundane, deceitful explanations. Yet, in 1692, there was a profound and widespread reluctance, particularly among the authorities and the most fervent believers, to accept natural or psychological causes for the afflictions, or to seriously entertain the possibility that the accusers might be mistaken, deluded, or even deliberately lying. The default explanation, reinforced by theological conviction and fear, was almost invariably supernatural. It had to be witchcraft. This refusal to consider alternative, more rational explanations was a key factor in allowing the hysteria to take root and flourish. Imagine trying to suggest, however cautiously, that perhaps the afflicted girls were suffering from a known, if poorly understood, physical ailment, or that their torments were the result of stress, fear, or even a youthful desire for attention or power in a society that otherwise afforded young women very little agency. Such suggestions, if voiced at all, would likely be met with stern disapproval or even accusations of impiety. To doubt the reality of the girl's demonic affliction was, in a sense, to doubt the reality of Satan's power, or even God's providential role in allowing such trials to test his people. It might also be seen as siding with the witches, of trying to cover up their evil deeds. The Puritan worldview, with its emphasis on a cosmic battle between God and Satan, often interpreted unexplained or negative events through a spiritual lens, making supernatural explanations not only plausible, but often preferable to more mundane ones. Even when inconsistencies or contradictions arose in the accuser's testimonies, or when individuals of impeccable reputation were accused, the authorities often found ways to rationalize these discrepancies within the witchcraft narrative, rather than questioning the narrative itself. Perhaps the devil was being particularly cunning, or perhaps the accused witch was especially powerful in their deceptions. The confirmation bias was incredibly strong. Once the premise of a demonic conspiracy was accepted, all subsequent information was filtered through that lens, with evidence supporting the theory being amplified and contradictory evidence being dismissed, reinterpreted, or ignored. Consider the case of John Proctor, a man known for his skepticism about the afflictions and his open criticism of the accusers. When he himself was accused, his prior doubts were likely seen not as evidence of his rationality, but as proof of his own demonic allegiance, an attempt by a witch to discredit the work of God. The social dynamics of the witch hunt created a powerful disincentive for skepticism. It was far safer to believe, or at least to feign belief, than to voice doubt and risk becoming a target yourself. A quirky, or rather tragically revealing detail, is that some of the afflicted girls themselves later recanted their testimonies, or admitted to exaggeration or even outright fabrication, but often only years after the executions had taken place, when the hysteria had subsided and it was safer to speak the truth or a different version of it. You, a modern man, would be screaming for a psychological evaluation of the accusers, for a thorough investigation into potential alternative causes, for a healthy dose of skepticism. But in 1692 Salem, skepticism was a dangerous commodity. The community, gripped by fear and a desperate need for answers, found those answers not in reason or medicine as we know it, but in the terrifyingly simple, all-encompassing explanation of witchcraft. And once that explanation took hold, it became almost impossible to dislodge, regardless of how many innocent lives it consumed. The evidence presented in the Salem Witch Trials was often a bewildering and contradictory mess, yet it was frequently accepted by the court as sufficient for conviction, even when faced with clear inconsistencies in the accuser's testimonies, alibis for the accused, or character witnesses vouching for their piety. The Salem magistrates and juries, heavily influenced by the prevailing hysteria and the perceived authority of spectral evidence, often chose to believe the accusers and condemn the accused. This highlights the terrifying reality that, in such an atmosphere, objective facts and logical inconsistencies often held little sway against the emotional power of fear and superstition. Imagine you are on trial, and one of the afflicted girls testifies that your specter was tormenting her in her bedchamber at precisely the same time that multiple credible witnesses, perhaps your own family members, swear under oath that your physical body was at home, miles away, engaged in some mundane activity. In a rational court, this would create significant doubt, but in Salem, it might be explained away by arguing that your specter, your demonic emanation, could travel independently of your physical form, or perhaps the witnesses defending you are themselves lying, or even bewitched into providing a false alibi. The possibilities for rationalizing away convenient facts were almost endless, as long as the underlying belief in your guilt remained firm. Consider the case where different afflicted girls gave conflicting accounts of your supposed demonic activities, or where their descriptions of your specter or your familiars changed from one examination to the next. These contradictions, rather than discrediting their testimony, might be ignored or attributed to the confusing and terrifying nature of demonic assaults, or even to the cunning of the devil in trying to sow discord and doubt. The burden of proof was effectively reversed. You were presumed guilty, and it was up to you to prove your innocence against evidence that was, by its very nature, often impossible to refute or even to logically engage with. Sometimes, an accused person might point out that their accuser had a known history of animosity towards them, perhaps due to a land dispute, a business rivalry, or a personal slight. This too was often dismissed. While such earthly motives might exist, They were seen as secondary to, or even manipulated by, the devil, who could exploit human weaknesses to further his own evil designs. The overwhelming belief in a vast, insidious demonic conspiracy often led the authorities to see patterns and connections where none existed, linking together disparate accusations and unrelated misfortunes into a grand narrative of satanic assault. A quirky, or rather deeply disturbing, example of this dismissal of contradictory evidence is the way that retractions, or expressions of doubt, from the afflicted girls themselves were sometimes handled. If an afflicted girl, perhaps in a moment of lucidity or conscience, tried to take back an accusation, or she might have been mistaken, she could come under immense pressure from her family, other afflicted individuals, or even the authorities, to reaffirm her original testimony, lest she too be accused of being in league with the devil or of trying to obstruct justice. You, a modern man, would be appalled by this blatant disregard for consistency, for logic, for the basic principles of evidence. It is a terrifying demonstration of how, when a community is gripped by a powerful delusion, the rules of reason can be suspended, and even the most glaring contradictions can be rationalized away in service of a pre-existing, unshakable belief. In the courtroom of Salem, the only consistent truth was the guilt of the accused. The bizarre medical and evidential tests used in Salem, the witch cake, the evil eye, the touch test, the search for a witch's teats, the pricking, the misrecited prayers, the spectral testimonies, the poppets, the imagined devil's book, the dismissal of contradictory evidence, all paint a horrifying picture of a justice system and a medical understanding, or lack thereof, gone terribly awry. As you, the accused, stand before this onslaught of irrationality, you are not just fighting for your life. You are a pawn in a much larger, darker game, being played out by a community in the grip of profound fear and a desperate search for scapegoats. The scientific and medical justifications offered for these tests, however flimsy or superstitious, served a crucial purpose. They lent an air of legitimacy and objectivity to what was, in reality, a brutal and often prejudiced persecution, allowing the community to believe it was acting not out of blind panic, but on the basis of discernible proof. Imagine the experts of Salem, the ministers, the magistrates, the physicians like Dr. Griggs, presenting these findings with an air of grave authority. They are not in their own minds perpetrating a fraud, at least not all of them, not always. They genuinely believe they are employing the best available knowledge and methods to uncover a hidden demonic evil. Their medical understanding is limited, their scientific method non-existent by modern standards, and their worldview is one in which the supernatural is an ever-present, tangible reality. When a girl convulses and then recovers after being touched by an accused person, it must mean something, and within their framework, it means witchcraft. When an unusual mole is found, it must be a witch's teat. These are not leaps of faith for them. They are logical deductions within a closed system of belief. This is, perhaps, the most chilling aspect of it all, the sincerity of the delusion. It is one thing to be persecuted by cynical manipulators. It is another, far more terrifying, thing to be condemned by individuals who genuinely, fervently believe they are doing God's work, that they are saving the community from an existential threat, and that their bizarre tests are valid instruments of truth. the danger of pseudo-science and religiously sanctioned prejudice, particularly when combined with a climate of fear and social unrest, is a recurring theme in history, and Salem stands as one of its most stark and cautionary examples. You see the earnestness in their eyes, the unshakable conviction in their voices, even as they describe the most outlandish proofs of your demonic compact. They are not necessarily evil men in the simplistic sense. Many are learned, respected members of their community, but they are men blinded by their beliefs, trapped in a worldview that allows for, and even demands, such horrors in the name of righteousness. The few individuals who dared to question the methods or the evidence, who appealed to reason or a more compassionate interpretation of Scripture, were often marginalized, dismissed, or even, as we've seen, accused themselves. A quirky, or rather profoundly sobering realization is that the science of one era can become the dangerous superstition of the next. The medical tests of Salem, which seemed so logical and definitive to many at the time, are now seen by us as barbaric, irrational, and tragic. It serves as a humbling reminder of the importance of critical thinking, of skepticism, of humility in the face of the unknown, and of the constant need to question our own certainties, lest we too, in our own way, become unwitting participants in a modern-day witch hunt, armed not with witch cakes and spectral evidence, but perhaps with different, more subtle, but equally dangerous forms of pseudo-scientific or ideological delusion. Your suffering, and the suffering of all of Salem's victims, is a timeless warning against the deadly marriage of ignorance and certainty, the bizarre medical tests, the spectral accusations, the coerced confessions, the trials by judges already convinced of guilt. All these threads weave together to form the tragic tapestry of the Salem witch hunt. The experts who believed they were diagnosing demonic possession through twitching dogs or insensitive skin were, in fact, diagnosing their own era's profound ignorance, its deep-seated fears, and its desperate need for scapegoats in a time of social and religious anxiety. The legacy of these pseudo-scientific proofs and the Salem witch trials as a whole is not just one of historical curiosity. It is a stark and enduring lesson about the catastrophic consequences that can arise when fear, superstition, and flawed reasoning masquerade as medical or legal authority, leading to the persecution and death of innocent people. As you, the unjustly accused, stand condemned, not by verifiable facts or rational evidence, but by a witch cake, a pointing finger, a misspoken prayer, or an old woman's mole. You are a victim of a system where science and medicine, such as they were, became tools of oppression rather than instruments of healing or truth. The very individuals entrusted with care and judgment, the physicians, the ministers, the magistrates, became, in many instances, the architects of your doom, their learning and authority perverted by the all-consuming hysteria. The search for witches' teats was not a medical examination. It was a violation. The touch test was not a diagnostic procedure. It was a theatrical charade. The pronouncements of doctor, Griggs were not sound medical judgments. They were a capitulation to supernatural explanations in the face of medical ignorance. This perversion of knowledge, this elevation of superstition to the level of evidence, is perhaps the most gay gawk, thorny, prickly legacy of Salem. It reminds us that expertise without critical thinking, without humility, without a commitment to empirical verification, can be incredibly dangerous. The Salem trials serve as a chilling example of how easily a community, even a devout and supposedly well-ordered one, can descend into madness when its leaders and its experts fail to uphold the principles of reason, justice, and basic human compassion. The irony is that true medical and scientific understanding was slowly advancing elsewhere in the world during this same period, the late 17th century, the dawn of the Enlightenment. But in the isolated, inward-looking, and fear-gripped crucible of Salem, these nascent glimmers of reason were largely extinguished by the blaze of puritanical fervor and demonic panic. The contrast between the scientific methods used in Salem and the burgeoning scientific revolution in Europe highlights the tragic divergence of paths and the terrible human cost of clinging to outdated and harmful belief systems. A quirky, or rather, profoundly important takeaway from the Salem saga and its bizarre medical tests is the enduring need for skepticism, for due process, and for the constant questioning of authority, especially when that authority claims to speak with absolute certainty on matters of life and death, based on evidence that cannot be seen, tested, or rationally refuted. Your suffering and that of the 19 others who were hanged, and those who died in jail, eventually led to a period of profound soul-searching and reform in Massachusetts. The lessons learned from Salem, however slowly and painfully, contributed to the development of a more just and rational legal system in America. Your voice silenced by the gallows ultimately became part of a larger chorus, demanding that such a tragedy never happen again. The strange, unsettling medical examinations, the pointing fingers, the spectral visions, all these fade now, like a fever dream receding with the dawn. The oppressive atmosphere of Salem, with its fear and its false certainties, begins to lift, replaced by the quiet sanity of your own time and space. You have walked through a gallery of bizarre and terrifying proofs, and witnessed how easily ignorance and hysteria can masquerade as knowledge and justice. Let the memory of that profound injustice, that perversion of reason, serve not to disturb your rest, but to deepen your appreciation for the hard-won principles of critical thinking and due process that we, however imperfectly, strive for today. The suffering of those condemned by witch cakes and evil eyes is over. Their story, though, remains a stark and necessary warning. As you settle into the comfort of your bed, let go of the chilling absurdities of Salem's medical witch hunt. There are no more spectral accusers, no more biased judges, no more terrifying tests to endure. There is only the peace of this moment, the gentle rhythm of your breath, and the quiet invitation to let your mind find solace in a deep, untroubled, and restorative sleep.